I think it's safe to say that most of us don't get enough hobby time, right? Maybe perhaps we get an hour a day, maybe 15 minutes, maybe 30 minutes, whatever the case. And all of this, of course, interferes with our ability to finish assembling and painting our models for the tabletop. Hey, it's the Procrastinating Professor, and today I'm going to be talking about planning and executing, i.e. painting, a hobby project within the span of about 7 to 8 hours in total, including assembly. And for this case, I'm going to be using skeletons as just an example. In the future, I will likely use this format again for different hobby projects because many of the lessons that I'll be sharing today can also be applied there. So for this, of course, 7 to 8 hours works out to about an hour a day. Some of us don't have that much time, it's totally fine, but at the very least, by thinking about how we can make things more efficient, we're able to complete our projects more quickly while still making sure that the models actually look pretty decent at the end of the day. Starting with assembly, there's usually not very much to say about this other than making sure that we are reading the instructions before we assemble things so that we are sure that we're using the most efficient route possible. In this case, of course, we could talk about tools, but for me, I keep my tools extremely simple. I use a very old cutter that I have. I've had this for like more than 10 years, I believe. And I have a GW mold line remover, which I got as a gift many years ago. And I use just a typical box cutter. You could use an X-Acto knife if you want to, but I'm used to big box cutters, so the tools that I'm familiar with allow me to work at the speed that I'm comfortable with. Now, of course, GW kits nowadays are very nicely molded. They don't have a lot of mold lines. If you were to build a racing kit, or maybe unfortunately some other kits from other companies, it may take a little bit more time. But one drawback that I did notice is that a lot of these parts for this kit were kind of forced pairings, right? You had these bags that only went with certain legs. You had these bags that only went with certain heads. And that, of course, not only limited the amount of variability I could get from these models, but it also meant that I couldn't cut everything out and then figure out how to put them together later on. That would have kind of potentially wasted more time down there, and all in all, that did, in my personal opinion, slow this thing down a little bit. The assembly took almost 2 hours down here, but you can still get kind of some variation as you can see down here. Of course, more important than the assembly process is the painting process, and I just want to give a few examples of some of my previous projects and how I took a little bit of inspiration from them. Now, the first one I'm showing here is a Morannon Orc. I did this in a method that I think many people would be familiar with. You do a base coat of some sort, you drown the entire model in wash, and then you work the highlights up back after that, right? The end product looks perfectly fine, it's perfectly reasonable. I'm not angry or displeased with this method of painting, but I do think that there are better ways of doing it rather than just drowning your models in Agrax Earthshade. A few years ago, when Rune Wars came out with some models, I actually experimented with using just washes for painting. So what you're seeing down here is something I painted predominantly with just washes. This was just before contrast paints came out. So I used a combination of very thin paints and some existing washes to do it, because the whole idea is that you want to get as much contrast as you can with as few steps as possible. As it turns out, one of the easiest ways to do that is to Zenithal highlight and then use translucent paints or pigments to add those automatic shades while leaving the highlighted areas, well, automatically highlighted. I then use this formula kind of on my Blood Bowl skeleton team, and you can kind of see the evolution, right? I think that this Blood Bowl skeleton looks a lot better than the Rune Wars one. It did take a little bit more time, but I like this scheme so much that I decided I'm going to go with this. It's going to be predominantly this kind of bluish black, which I use Drakenhof Nightshade as the main color for, because I really do like this sort of bluish armor kind of look rather than metallic armor. It reminds me of the cover of the new Soulblight book. And I'm going to be using red as a secondary color because the kind of bluish blacks and the warm colors of the red contrast each other very well. So in order to do this, first things first is we have to start with a Zenithal. And this is probably the first time on video that I'm doing a black to white Zenithal, right? I usually use other colors. But again, if we're trying to work things quickly, we want to get things painted quickly, first and foremost, you want to get as much contrast with as little work as possible. As it turns out, black and white gives extremely good contrast, who would have thought, right? Secondly, I am using inks instead of acrylic paints simply because inks give this kind of very nice, very vibrant, very intense coloration with very few layers. They're very thin, so I can just dump them in the airbrush. I do not dilute my inks, and I can just spray it on and I get this result immediately, as you can see. Now, one thing you will notice, however, in this case is that you'll notice that the airbrushing is a little bit splotchy, right? You can see all of these small little dots, and that is intentional. What I did was, unlike the usual cases where I put very high pressure for my airbrush, I actually purposely cranked this really low. I think this was like 10 or 15 psi. It's essentially as low as I could get it while still functioning as an airbrush because I wanted that splotchy look. I wanted this kind of rough, unrefined, under highlighting, right? So that when I put my translucent paints over it, you can still hopefully kind of sort of see the roughness and unevenness from the bottom. If you don't like this effect, then it's very simple. Just increase the pressure of your airbrush and you will get, of course, a much smoother transition. It's entirely up to you. Now for the reds, I tried two different things. I tried using the red contrast straight from the pot, and I tried using red contrast pre-tin with, in this case, a little bit of varnish, and I found unsurprisingly that if you pre-tin a lot of these contrast paints, you do lose a little bit of vibrancy. So I decided in this case, I'm just going to go straight from the pot because, again, the other thing about getting things painted quickly is that you want to get maximum color as fast as you can, right? So if I wanted it to be a really intense red, I'm just going to use the contrast paint right out of the pot. Now, if I had a red ink, I would have probably used it instead of a contrast paint, but I don't have a normal red ink, and I didn't feel like going out to buy any new paints for a single painting project, so I just used the contrast paint because I already happen to have this lying around. What I do have, however, instead of just normal red ink, is I have an orangey red ink. And for the next step, I'm going to be combining this orangey red ink with turquoise ink. Now, some of you are wondering to yourselves, well, Professor, what kind of color do you actually get when you combine turquoise with reddish orange? And the answer is, well, depending on how much red and how much turquoise you put, you could end up with kind of this Dragonhof nightshade kind of blackish bluish color, which was what I was going for. You see, one of the big problems with painting using washes like what I did in the past for my Blood Bowl skeleton was that in order for me to get the color really intense, what I had to do was I had to supplement the Dragonhof Nightshade with actual normal black and normal dark blue paints, which meant that it took more steps and took more time. I didn't want that to happen again. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm just using these inks because, as you can see from the video, a single application gives me the intensity that I wanted. And I purposely wanted this kind of not black coloration, something that's a little bit blue, simply because the cold blue colors are going to contrast very well with the warmer colors of the reds, and of course the golds that I'll be adding on later. I'll also be using a little bit of rust, and of course there's going to be a little bit of extra browns and whatnot lying around as well to kind of give this warm and cold contrasting look. So you can see it's very easy, it's very straightforward. I'm sure there's probably some sort of contrast paint or some other paint out there which does the exact same thing as this, but again, I find that inks are really easy to work with. They flow everywhere, they are really intense, and they save so much time. If I had like a whole collection of inks, if I learned about inks earlier, I think I would have just bought more inks rather than other sorts of paints, if I'm being completely honest, for this sort of work. Of course, them being so thin means that they're very difficult to work with outside of using them for this sort of purpose, so do bear that in mind if you do intend to purchase inks for yourself. So this is how it looks. It is a fairly nice and final product. I'm very happy with how it looks. So we're going to move on to the next color. I'm going to be using Sigmar brown for all of the brown parts. So this includes the handles of the spears. It also, in my case, it also included all of the leather straps and whatnot. Here's the thing, right? I found out after using Sigmar brown that there is actually a leather colored contrast paint. I didn't have it. I didn't even know it existed. I should have probably checked, but I didn't. So long story short, if I were to do this again, I would have probably used a lighter shade for the leather straps, but again, I'm just working with what I have. I think it's fine. It's a lot easier to just use one color anyway. I'm totally not just coping with a mistake in my color choice, but that's fine. So again, this contrast paint does go on very well, although because it's so dark, sometimes it's a little bit difficult to make out actually the shades and the highlights, especially if you look at it from afar. So what I realized was that by using this coloration, it meant that I had to actually go back later on and work on the highlights a little bit more, which you'll see later on. Now, for the gold, quote-unquote gold, I'm using this combination of silver and bright bronze. The reason why I'm doing it this way is because I didn't want it to, of course, be too brassy. That was one thing that I thought about. I didn't want because you see, here's the thing. If the bronze was very bronze, I was afraid that it would kind of blend in together with the red. It wouldn't stand out too much. And I didn't want it to be gold either, because these are just kind of troops. I don't think they should have a really nice, intense gold. So I kind of went with this sort of muted coloration instead. And I actually thinned it quite a bit with thinner. As you can kind of see, it's extremely watery, and that's intentional simply because I just wanted it to be a very light color. And later on, when we actually do the washing step, you'll notice that the washes actually add to the brownness of this color. So metallic is still going to contrast pretty well with itself, and it's of course going to look fairly distinct from the red capes that are around it. When you know that you're going to be working on a very intense wash, like I know I'm going to be using oils very soon, it's not a bad idea to actually intentionally use a slightly lighter color instead of what you're hoping to get at the end of the day, so that your final color doesn't end up too dark. So for the silver parts, I'm using chainmail silver, again thinned down with a little bit of acrylic medium. Again, I just want it to be not too intense, and I want it to be very slightly translucent. Because we already have the Zenithal underneath, the silver is going to stand out pretty well over the white undercoat, so I do not need to worry. If I did not have the white down there, then this silver would be too thin to show over, for example, a black undercoat. Now, let's move on to the oils. For the first oil, I'm going to be using this umber color for all of the quote-unquote gold parts, as well as all of the bone parts. You also notice that in this case, I did not use a gloss coat before applying the oils, unlike my previous tutorials, simply because in this case, I didn't necessarily want to do it for any sort of lining. In the past, when I usually use the gloss coat, I will of course use it for when I'm using my oils for lining panels and whatnot. In this case, I just kind of want to cover the whole model. So what I did was I used satin varnish instead. I didn't film that, but there is a satin varnish before I started washing it. And then for every other part of the model, I'm just going to use a black oil wash. I'm going to apply it very liberally all over the model. And at this point, of course, you may be concerned that you're kind of ruining your paint job, especially for the red parts, because you're going to be covering your red with this black gunk almost. But don't worry, because as with all oil washes, that's really hard to say, you're going to be, of course, removing a fair bit of these oil washes later on. So you can see in some cases, it's really scary, right? You can see that it's practically black over the red, and that's perfectly normal. This is how it tends to look sometimes. Alright, and then now we're just going to start removing it. So again, I took a cotton swab, I dipped it in some odorless thinner and just went to town. So a few things to keep in mind. If you do this very quickly after you apply your oils, you don't actually need so much thinner. In fact, if you're only painting a handful of models, let's say 5 or 10, chances are you may still be able to actually work on them with very little to no thinner. But in my case, I actually put quite a bit of it, because by the time I finished all of these models, I just kind of left them overnight and then came back to them after that. So some time had passed, so I purposely had to wet my Q-tip a little bit more. You'll notice that my Q-tip is a little bit too wet, if I'm being completely honest, but that's fine. Alright, at the end of the day, all that I'm looking for is removing the top part so that the highlights kind of still show up while leaving the recesses shaded. Now, working on the red highlights, I'm going to be using basic flesh to do this kind of very extreme contrast. You see, I'm only applying it to certain edges. I am not fully edge lining the red. It's a fairly stark comparison, but in all honesty, when you look at the final model, I feel like it actually just kind of works well together. Again, under normal circumstances, if I wasn't kind of painting to a timer, I would have actually used more shades in between. But in this case, speed painting, let's just go quickly. Now for the rust, I'm using this rust texture from Green Stuff World. You don't have to use this brand if you don't want to, it's perfectly fine. There are a lot of brands out there for this, but I just happen to also have this. In fact, this is the first time I'm actually using it. So this kind of material, it's a little bit like textured paint. It is an orangey color, which I felt again contrasted very well with the bluish color of the armor. And I just apply it anywhere that there was damage on any of the metallic parts. So for example, all the black parts and all the silver parts, it gives this very nice weathered look without very much effort. And because the rust paint already has grit in it, there's no need to, of course, apply any further texture. So one single application is all that's necessary for this. And kind of see me just looking around for holes and then just putting a little bit of this rust down there. Now to highlight the bones, I'm using pure white. Under normal circumstances, if I wasn't painting to a timer, I would have probably used some sort of off-white or beige in between. But again, because we are trying to quote-unquote speed paint things, the less steps, the better in a sense. And if we're able to increase the contrast, in this case, we want to make it as bright as possible, we're going to use the brightest paint that doesn't look out of place. So in this case, for bone, it's perfectly reasonable to use pure white. Curiously, when you think about it, this means that this entire skeleton model was painted with zero bone colored paints, but that's perfectly fine. At the same time, while you're watching me paint these small little details with my brush, you can also take a look at the red and you can see how the flesh highlights, even though they're a little bit stark and a little bit extreme, they kind of do still work together with the red. It doesn't stand out too much, but it does kind of capture the edges a little bit, so it draws the eye to it very quickly. One of the things about speed painting, which I think a lot of people kind of overlook, is that they want to get things done so fast that they don't take just a few extra minutes here and there to really draw out the details like this, right? Yes, some may argue that, oh, it's going to take so much time to kind of outline the bones and outline all the small little bits of the faces with this white coloration. But at the same time, it really gives you that beautiful and intense contrast as compared to just dry brushing it. Dry brushing, the contrast tends to be a little bit soft and you don't get so much contrast out of it. Now for the next step, it was a little bit gratuitous if I'm being completely honest. I was thinking to myself, oh, you know, since I used turquoise ink earlier on, maybe perhaps I'm going to mix it with my white. I'm going to get this nice light turquoise color for the highlights of my black armor using one part of the same paint that I used earlier on. The reason why I'm saying it in this slightly sarcastic tone is because I realized after mixing it that I basically just made Baharoth blue. I should have probably just used the paint straight out of the pot. So moving forward in the future, I'm not going to do this again for this specific paint scheme if I were to paint more skeletons. But it's just something to keep in mind that, yeah, sometimes, you know, maybe perhaps just use colors out of the pot rather than trying to be a little bit fancy like me. So yay, extra complicated Baharoth blue. Well, if you never experiment, you never know, right? So anyway, using this really light blue color, I am going to again use it as an extreme highlight for the black armor plates. And you'll notice that sometimes I make mistakes like this, and because the paint is very thin, I'm able to immediately fix it by wetting my brush and just kind of moving the paint out of the way. So you'll notice, long story short, if you're trying to paint things quickly, get as much contrast as you can, so as dark as possible to as light as possible without the model looking weird. So in this case, I wanted a blue coloration for the highlights so that I get this kind of full color. I'm just edge highlighting certain parts. I'm not even edge highlighting the entire model, just certain areas where I perceive would catch the most light. The fact that I'm not edge highlighting the entire model also saves me a lot of time, and I don't need to, because of course the edges that I did not intentionally highlight are still a little bit highlighted by the fact that they were Zenithal highlighted, and because I used inks, the inks wouldn't of course pool at the edges, so the edges would still be a little bit lighter than the other parts in the recesses anyway. So again, with translucent paints and the Zenithal highlight, you kind of save a lot of time on all of these edge highlights as well. You'll notice the entire model, I've only basically used one single color for edge highlighting rather than the usual God knows 2 or 3 that I typically use for my other paint jobs. You'll also notice that I did absolutely no dry brushing in this entire model, because dry brushing, as I mentioned just now, it's a little bit faded. The contrast that you get from dry brushing sometimes is not as intense as I like it to be. I'm not saying dry brushing is bad. I'm just saying that it tends to be overused by people who are trying to paint things quickly. Now for the leather, I'm using orange leather again. This is a color I really love for painting leather because I just like that orangey hue that it has. As I mentioned earlier, my leathers are a little bit darker than I would have wanted it to be, but that's perfectly fine. In this case, I'm also going to be using this color to highlight the spear shafts as well. Again, just one single color for the leather instead of the 2 to 3 that I typically use for leather. Usually I'll use at least 1 or 2 more colors to highlight the leather down here, but I'm just not doing that for the purpose of this model. So you'll notice I use the tip of my brush quite a bit to just very gently paint the surface. It's fairly similar in a sense to dry brushing, right? But instead of the brush being dry, there's actually paint on it. I just lightly touch the tip of my brush on the texture that I want to paint. And you also still see me periodically washing my brush and then using the wet brush to kind of move paint out of the way if I did not want the paint there. It's very similar to some of my previous videos where I showed I used feathering quite a bit. For all of the golds, I'm using a very bright silver, in this case literally silver, for the exact same reasons as I mentioned just now. I just wanted the maximum contrast, and you'll notice that I'm only picking out certain areas to be painted with this silver. I am not dry brushing anything. And in this case, unfortunately, the shields take a little bit of working because they're so incredibly detailed. It did make me appreciate how detailed these models are though. I also used it to highlight a little bit of the armor wherever there's any battle damage, also kind of just showing the maybe tips of the rusted areas that might still be a little bit shiny here and there. I also use the same silver for the swords, and of course using the same silver for the golds and the silvers. It kind of ties the model together a little bit better while saving some time. As you can see from this final image, the new quote-unquote paint recipe is fairly similar to my old one, but it's of course a lot faster, and the blue color is more intense than the one that I had on my Blood Bowl team. You can't really see it in the video perhaps, but just gotta trust me that it's definitely a lot bluer. I will be having some pictures of it on my Instagram and you can compare it with some of the pictures of my Blood Bowl team down there as well. So there you have it. I completed this in about 7 hours or so. I did do a little bit of course, freehand on the banners, which took me about an extra 45 minutes. Again, one of the important things about making speed painted models look good is to spend a little bit of time on details. As I mentioned just now, I spent a little bit of time making sure that I did the highlights nicely and neatly, and of course having some banners with extra detailed paint jobs on them also helped draw the eye to it. So that's it. I hope that this video has helped all of you. Please do consider subscribing and liking this video as well, and I'll see all of you soon. Take care.